When Kirk Douglas arrived late, John Wayne's revenge shocked everyone. Tucson, Arizona, March 1966. There is a particular kind of tension that exists between two men who are each accustomed to being the largest thing in a room. It is not hostile exactly, or not always. It is more like the tension between two weather systems that have moved into the same geography. Each one has its own pressure, its own direction, its own internal logic. When they meet, something happens. What happens depends on the systems. John Wayne and Kirk Douglas had been moving in the same geography for 20 years. They had made one picture together, Cast a Giant Shadow, a 1966 Mirish Company production about Mickey Marcus, the American officer who had helped build the Israeli army in 1948. Douglas had the lead. Wayne had a supporting role, a cameo of significant weight, the kind of appearance that a man of his stature makes when he believes in the project and wants to lend it something of what he has accumulated. They were not close friends. They were professional contemporaries who respected each other's work with the specific, slightly competitive respect of men who occupy adjacent territory and have never fully resolved whose territory is whose. Wayne was 58. Douglas was 49. Wayne had been the dominant box office force in Hollywood for the better part of 2 decades. Douglas had made Spartacus 6 years earlier and had been since that picture, a different kind of star than he had been before it. Not larger, necessarily, different, more deliberately serious about what the work was for. They had not been in the same production since 1963, a thing that had not involved them being on set at the same time for any extended period. Cast a Giant Shadow put them in Tucson together for 3 weeks. On the morning of March 14, 1966, Kirk Douglas was 4 hours late to set. What John Wayne did about it shocked everyone who was there and has been told wrong in every version that has circulated since. This is the right version. The production had been in Tucson for 11 days when it happened. The logistics of a period military picture in the desert are not simple. They involve equipment and extras and technical consultants, and the specific challenge of making 1948 Israel look like itself in the Arizona desert, which it resembles more than you might expect, which is why Tucson kept getting chosen for pictures set in the Middle East. The days were long. The heat was what Tucson heat is in March, which is not summer but is a preview of summer, a polite warning about what is coming. The crew was large and experienced and had the particular efficiency of a unit that has been working together long enough to have resolved most of the logistical questions and is now focused entirely on the work. Wayne was on set every day at call time. This was not incidental. It was not a virtue he performed. It was the habit of a man who had been working in this industry since 1928 and who had a specific understanding of what a set cost per hour and what it meant to make the people responsible for that cost wait. His call time was 6 in the morning on most production days. He was there at 5:45, not to be noticed being there early, not to make a point, because 5:45 was when he was ready and being present were the same thing to him and had been for 38 years. Douglas's call time on March 14th was 6 in the morning. The 6 o'clock scenes were a 2-shot, Wayne and Douglas, a dialogue sequence that required both of them, that could not be shot around and could not be usefully rearranged without restructuring the day's schedule in ways that would cascade through the rest of the week. At 6 o'clock, Wayne was at his mark. Douglas was not on set. At 6:15, the assistant director checked with Douglas's trailer. The trailer was empty. At 6:30, the production office was called. Douglas had left his hotel. He was en route. At 7, he had not arrived. At 8, the first AD began making the kind of decisions that first ADs make when a principal is absent and the day is burning. He began rearranging. He began finding sequences that could be shot without Douglas, reverses and cutaways, and the coverage that always exists in a schedule, but is supposed to be insurance, not the main event. At 10 o'clock, Kirk Douglas arrived on set. He had been delayed. The explanation involved a meeting that had run long. The meeting was real. The delay was genuine. It was not contempt for the production, and it was not disregard for the people waiting. It was 4 hours late, and John Wayne was standing at his mark, where he had been for 4 hours when Douglas walked onto the set. The crew was watching. This is the thing about a film set that civilians do not fully account for. A film set is a contained world, self-referential and acutely social, where every interaction between principals is observed by 60 or 80 people who have nothing to do but watch when they are not actively working, and who are, as a professional community, extraordinarily attentive to the dynamics of power and temperament. Everyone on that set had watched Wayne arrive at 5:45. Everyone had watched 6 o'clock come and go. Everyone had watched the first AD begin his rearrangements with the controlled frustration of a skilled professional absorbing a disruption he had not caused and could not resolve. Everyone had watched Wayne stay at his mark, or near it, through 8 o'clock and 9 and 10. They were watching when Douglas arrived. They were watching for what Wayne would do. A man of Wayne's stature in 1966, on his own production, because while this was Mirish, Wayne was a producer on the picture and had weight that exceeded his credit, had options. He had the option of making Douglas's arrival publicly uncomfortable. He had the option of the cold reception, the professional frost that communicates without stating that a line has been crossed. He had the option of the escalated complaint, the kind that goes to the director and the producer and becomes a formal record of the disruption. He had the option of the story, the one that gets told, the one that travels through the industry network at the speed of professional gossip and attaches itself to a name and becomes part of what people know about you when your name comes up. He had been in the industry for 38 years. He knew exactly how to use every one of those options. The crew was watching to find out which one he chose. He chose none of them. He walked across the set to where Kirk Douglas was being met by the first AD, and he waited while the AD gave Douglas the abbreviated version of the morning's adjustments, and when the AD was done, he put out his hand. Douglas looked at him. He shook it. Wayne said, "Glad you made it. You ready to work?" Douglas said, "I'm ready." Wayne said, "Good. Let's not waste any more of the day." He walked back to his mark. The crew went back to work. That is the version that gets told as a story about John Wayne being the bigger man, about professional grace under provocation, about a movie star who had the power to make someone's day very difficult and chose not to. And that is all true. But it is not the whole of what happened that day, and the part that gets left out is the part that tells you something true about Wayne that the other part does not. At lunch, Wayne found Douglas, not in front of the crew, not in a context where the conversation was being observed. He found him at the lunch tables on the edge of the production camp, where Douglas was eating with his personal assistant and the director, Melville Shavelson, who had been managing the morning with the compressed patience of a director who has learned to accommodate the realities of working with stars of this magnitude. Wayne sat down. Shavelson looked at him. Douglas looked at him. Wayne poured himself a coffee and said, "Tell me about the meeting." Douglas looked at him. Not the question he was expecting. Not the tone he was expecting. He told Wayne about the meeting. It was a meeting Douglas had been trying to get for 8 months. It involved the financing of a project he had been developing, a project that was not cast a giant shadow and was not any project anyone at the Mirish Company was involved in, a project of Douglas's own that he had been building toward, and that required a specific conversation with a specific man who had a specific window of availability that had presented itself that morning and would not present itself again for the foreseeable future. He had taken the meeting. He had been right to take the meeting. He had also been wrong to not tell anyone he was taking it, to not call the production office, to not build into his morning a margin that would have gotten him to set by 8, even if the meeting ran long. He said both of those things himself, without Wayne asking. Wayne listened. He nodded. He said, "What's the project?" Douglas told him. They talked about it for 45 minutes, not about Cast a Giant Shadow, not about the morning, about the project Douglas was building, which was serious and ambitious, and had the quality of something a man who has made Spartacus undertakes when he has decided that the size of the stage matters, and that he is going to build the largest stage available to him. Wayne listened the way he listened to things that interested him, with the direct, specific attention of a man who is not processing what he hears into something else, but simply taking it in. At the end of the 45 minutes, he said, "That's worth the meeting." Douglas looked at him. Not what he expected. Wayne said, "Not worth 4 hours on my set, but worth the meeting." He said it without heat and without edge. As a plain accounting, Douglas said, "You're right on both." Wayne said, "I know." "That's not why I'm saying it." Douglas asked why he was saying it. Wayne was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because the project sounds right, and projects that sound right don't always get made. And if you lose the financing because you were protecting the schedule on someone else's picture, that's the wrong loss to take." Douglas looked at him. He said, "That's not what I expected you to say." Wayne said, "What did you expect?" Douglas thought about it. He said, A lecture on professionalism. Wayne said, "You already know the lecture. You've been in this business as long as I have. You don't need me to give it to you." He finished his coffee. He stood up. He said, "Tell me when the project comes together. I'll see if there's something in it for me." He went back to the set. Shavelson, who had been sitting at the table for the entire conversation, told it to a journalist in 1987 during a retrospective interview about his career. He said it was the most efficient exercise in conflict resolution he had ever seen on a set. He said Wayne could have burned that morning into Douglas's professional memory for the rest of his career. He had the standing to do it and the audience and the cause. Instead, he found out what had actually happened, and then he told Douglas the truth about both sides of it. And then he moved on. No residue. The afternoon was clean. Shavelson said the thing that stayed with him was the end of it. The part where Wayne said, "Tell me when the project comes together." He said that was not a polite thing. That was a real thing. And Douglas knew it was real, and it changed the temperature of everything that came after it. The afternoon shoot, Shavelson said, was the best work they had gotten from either man on the entire production. Not because the conflict had been resolved, because something better than resolution had happened. The two weather systems had found a way to move in the same direction. For one afternoon in Tucson, at least, the project Douglas had been building did not get made. Not then. The financing came together and fell apart, and came together in a different form and fell apart again in the way that ambitious projects fall apart, which is repeatedly and from different directions and with intervals of apparent progress that make each collapse harder than the last. Douglas spent 3 years on it. He did not get it made. He made other pictures instead, good ones, because he was Kirk Douglas, and not making the picture you intend to make does not mean you stop working. Wayne was not in any of them. Not because of March 14, 1966. Because the pictures did not have the right part. They saw each other on the circuit. The premieres and the industry events, and the specific social geography of Hollywood in the late 60s, where everyone of a certain stature moved through the same rooms on the same occasions with the same managed familiarity. When they were in the same room, they talked, not at length. The specific comfortable shorthand of men who had had one real conversation and did not need to have it again but had it as a reference point. Douglas said later that Wayne was one of the few people in Hollywood who had never once spoken to him as though he was being managed. He said, "Most conversations in that world have a purpose underneath them. That is not the conversation." With Wayne, the conversation was the conversation. You always knew where you stood. He said it in a 1991 interview. He said it without being asked about Wayne specifically. The interviewer had asked about Douglas's relationships with his contemporaries, and Douglas had answered in general terms and then said, specifically, that Wayne was different in this respect. The interviewer asked how. Douglas said, "He told me the truth about the morning I was late on his picture. Both sides of it. The truth about what I had done wrong and the truth about what I had done right, in the same breath, without making either one larger than the other." He said that's hard to do. Most people can do one or the other. He did both. There is a thing that happens between men of a certain kind of stature, in any field but particularly in fields where the stature is visible and constantly measured, where the comparison is always available and always being made by someone. The thing that happens is a competition that never fully resolves. Not a hostile competition, not necessarily even a conscious one, but a permanent measuring, a checking of the other person's position against your own, a calculation that runs underneath every interaction. Wayne and Douglas had that. Of course they did. They were two of the most significant figures in American cinema in the same era, with overlapping audiences and different aesthetics and the specific rivalry of men who had each built something large enough to be aware of the other's size. What happened in Tucson in March of 1966 did not dissolve that, but it changed the quality of it. It changed it from the kind of competition that diminishes both participants because each one is spending energy watching the other instead of watching the work, to the kind that clarifies, that shows each man something about the other, that makes the other more real and therefore more valuable as a presence in the field. Wayne had shown Douglas that he was not going to use the morning as leverage. That was the first thing. But the more important thing was what he had shown Douglas at lunch. He had shown him that he was interested in the project, that he had listened to the description and formed an honest assessment, and the honest assessment was that the project was worth what it had cost to pursue. A man who will tell you your project is worth pursuing when he has just spent 4 hours waiting for you, is a man whose assessment of your project means something. He has no incentive to flatter you. He has significant incentive to diminish you. When he chooses neither and simply tells you the truth lands differently than any other delivery of the same information would have landed. Douglas knew that. It changed what Wayne's opinion meant to him. It changed it for the rest of his career. Cast a Giant Shadow was released in April of 1966. It received mixed reviews. The picture was ambitious and uneven in the way that ambitious pictures sometimes are, reaching for something that was not fully achieved while still producing sequences and performances that justified the reaching. Wayne's performance was one of the things that was achieved. He was in the picture for perhaps 20 minutes of screen time, and in those 20 minutes he did what he had learned to do over 38 years, which was to be so completely present and so specifically himself that the camera had no choice but to find him true. Douglas was good in it. He was often good. The particular quality of his acting, the intensity of it, the way his face made the internal external without quite losing the internal, was well suited to Marcus, who was a man of genuine historical complexity, idealistic and pragmatic in the same breath, capable of inspiring others while remaining privately uncertain. The picture did not fully earn the complexity of its subject, but the two men in the room together, in the scenes they had, produced something that the picture around them did not always produce. Chemistry is not the right word. Chemistry implies ease, and what they produced was not easy. It was honest. The morning had made it honest. A man who stands at his mark for 4 hours and then shakes your hand and says, "Glad you made it," has told you something about himself, and the afternoon scenes, shot after the lunch table conversation, carried that information in both directions. Wayne knew Douglas would have taken the meeting. Douglas knew Wayne would have waited. The scenes knew it too. Wayne told the story once, in 1971, to a journalist named Scott Iman, who was profiling him for a magazine piece that touched on his relationships with other major stars of the era. He did not tell it as a grievance. He told it as an example of something he had been asked about, which was how you maintain a working relationship with people who are also your competition. He said, "Kirk was late to my set once. 4 hours. The crew thought I was going to make something of it. I didn't. The journalist asked why not. Wayne said, because I found out why, and the why was right even if the handling was wrong. And if you have a choice between making a man feel the full weight of his mistake and telling him the truth about both sides of it, you tell him the truth. The weight lands heavier and cleaner, and it doesn't leave a bruise that costs you later." The journalist wrote it down. He used 2 sentences of it in the piece. The rest sat in his notes for 20 years until he wrote a longer account of it in the early 90s when he was working on a longer study of the era. He said in that account that it was the most concise description of a professional philosophy he had ever gotten from a movie star, and that the 2 sentences he had used in the original piece had not done it justice. He was right. It did not need the full account to be true. But the full account is what the truth looked like in practice. 4 hours at a mark. A handshake at 10 o'clock. 45 minutes at a lunch table asking about a project. The weight lands heavier and cleaner, and it doesn't leave a bruise that costs you later. That is not a quote from a picture. It is a philosophy applied on a set in Tucson in March of 1966 to a situation that gave Wayne every justification to do something smaller. He did not do something smaller. He did the thing that was harder and more lasting and true on both sides, which is, when you look at the whole of what this series of stories has been describing, the only thing he ever knew how to do when the moment asked him for it. The set in Tucson was struck in April of 1966. The equipment went back to Los Angeles. The crew dispersed. The desert went back to being the desert, which it does without any assistance, indifferent to what was made on it and what was argued about and what was resolved. The picture came out. The reviews came out. The industry moved on to the next picture and the next argument, and the next morning where someone was at their mark at 5:45 and someone else was 4 hours late. But in the network of people who were there, who were on that set for those 3 weeks, the story moved the way all the stories in this series have moved. Person to person, carefully, with each telling a little more careful than the one before. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Because the crew of 60 people who watched a man stand at his mark for 4 hours and then shake the hand of the man who had made him wait had seen something they did not see every day. Not patience. That is too simple. Not grace. That is too soft. Something harder than both. The deliberate choice to respond to a provocation with the most useful truth available rather than the most satisfying reaction. The weight lands heavier and cleaner. It does, every time. That is what they saw. That is what they remembered. That is what gets passed on. Douglas called Wayne in 1973. The project had finally died. The last financing had fallen through in a way that was final, the kind of collapse that a man with Douglas's experience recognizes as the end rather than another interval. He called to tell Wayne it was not getting made. Wayne asked why he was calling to tell him that. Douglas said, "You told me to tell you when it came together. It didn't come together." That seemed worth saying. Wayne was quiet for a moment. He said, "What's next?" Douglas told him what was next. Wayne said, "That sounds right too." That was the whole call. If this one found you, pass it on. Share it with someone who has been at their mark, waiting, and had to decide what to do when the person they were waiting for finally showed up. Subscribe if you haven't yet. More stories coming.